Hi guys and welcome to my channel. My name is Liv and this video is a tutorial on pigeon pose. How to get the alignment right, how to feel it into the right places and not feel it into the wrong places. So firstly, let's look at the purpose or what we're trying to achieve with our pigeon pose. Pigeon pose is a hip opener, but because the hip can move in lots of directions, there's different ways that we can open the hips, and pigeon pose is an external hip rotation. So that means we're taking the thigh to the outer side of the pelvis and it's sort of rolling the thigh slightly backwards and away from us. That means it's going to be stretching through our glutes, it's going to be lengthening through the inner thigh of this front leg, but actually when we come into the position of pigeon pose, depending on how we position our torso, and we'll get to this alignment, we can also be lengthening through our hip flexor, so the front muscle of the back leg as well. So when it comes to setting up or getting into it, how do we do it? I find I like to come either from like a plank or a down dog. If I try and come from some sort of smaller tabletop position, it's a bit small, it's a bit crunchy, it's hard to get into. So give yourself the space underneath the body, either hips up or not, and then drawing your knee wider than the point of your hip. So I like to guide the knee just wider than my wrist in a down dog. What we mean by this is if my pelvis is here, the knee wants to be wider than the point of the hip so that we're actually achieving that external rotation. What we want to avoid is that knee coming in front of the hip, almost in one line, and everything feeling like it's going to fall to one side. So once you've placed that knee a little wider, the shin is on a diagonal across the front of the mat. Now we're going to come back to this point because it's a very hot topic of pigeon, but the shin is at a diagonal of varying degrees. So that depends on your flexibility as to how much it may or may not be at a diagonal. So then our back leg is going directly out behind us. So sort of imagine your body has these train tracks, it's going directly out behind us. The knees and the toes point down. They don't point off towards one side. So making sure they point down, you can either keep toes tucked or not, depending on how sort of active or relaxing you're trying to make this pose. So the height of our hips here is very dependent on our flexibility. There's no right and wrong. Something that I see a lot of people try and do is insist on getting their hips towards the floor. So it's a little bit more easy to visualize from the outer hip side. This gap underneath your bum is correct, it's allowed. We don't have to be closing the gap. Think of it perhaps like splits pose. Not everybody can sit their bum to the floor because their flexibility is not there. Exactly the same in pigeon pose. Most people's hips will be risen away from the mat, and the less flexibility or less range we have in this hip, the higher we are going to be. Now in terms of what you do with that space, you can leave it there. You don't have to prop it up. It can be quite slow in a vinyasa class to find your props and put something under there, but a very nice idea if you're taking perhaps a slower paced, restorative, release and relax stretch is to give yourself something that you can sink against. Perhaps if you're working more into mobility and strength, you can leave the gap there, making the hip muscle work that little bit harder to hold your balance. So then what about the foot, or perhaps the ankle more appropriately? I feel it's an overdone cue when you hear people say flex the foot, protect the knee. Obviously we want to look after our knee, but in pigeon pose specifically, the one that we're looking at today, actually flexing the foot is not applicable to most positions within the stretch. Because as we come into our pigeon pose with this shin on a bit of a diagonal or varying degrees of a diagonal, our shin bone is actually angled slightly down towards the floor. That makes it impossible to flex the foot. The foot would need to start carving a gouge out of the floor. So we keep the ankle in line with the rest of the shin, and it tends to be the top of the foot, the little toe edge of the foot that rests against the mat. We'll come to the flexed foot position in variations in just a moment. That being said, something we want to look out for is making sure that the front knee feels happy. By that, I mean it doesn't feel excessive pressure. It definitely doesn't feel pain. A couple of things to perhaps look at if you are experiencing problems with your knee is your leg too bent? So we're talking about this diagonal, but if it's very, very bent, the knee is actually working its way into a very, very deep range of flexion, as well as having our body weight down against it. So it could be that you have your leg too bent, your foot is too far back, in which case readjust, take that foot that little bit further forwards. Otherwise, it might be that you're pushing too hard into the stretch. With this hip opener, we're stretching into our glutes, a very, very big, very, very strong muscle. If we are forcing our stretch or pushing too hard, the tension and the lack of range that we have in that muscle, that starts to say, now I'm not going to stretch anymore, all this tension that you're giving me, I'm going to send it elsewhere, and I'm going to send it to a weaker joint, and that's where it starts to get transferred down towards our knee, causing sort of twisting, torquing movements which do not feel nice. So ease out of the stretch a little, let your hips come higher, see if that solves your issue. If it doesn't and your knee is really unhappy in this pose, take a reclined pigeon, or dead pigeon as I like to call it, figure 4 shape. Take the ankle over the thigh, move the knee away from you, and pull the shin or the thigh in towards the body here. This stretch stretches the hips and glutes and that inner thigh in exactly the same way that pigeon does, without the pressure of gravity and body weight, which causes strain on the knee. It's really not worth forcing a pose that your body is just not happy to practice. So let's just take a quick look at what we can do with the upper body once you've brought yourself into your pigeon stretch. By staying more upright, not only are we putting more demand onto the hip flexor, so we're stretching through the front of the back leg a little bit more, but we're having to use our lower back muscles, our spinal erectors, to keep that chest up. Generally, what can be a little bit more comfortable is to let the forearms come down. So this takes the demand or the stretch further out of this hip flexor, but as we have folded over our front leg, it takes the stretch into the glutes that little bit more. So it's likely going to focus the stretch into that primary region a little bit more. From here, further advancing the pose would be to step the hands away and bring the forehead down to the mat. That is essentially advancing the stretch, so it's not somewhere that you have to go to complete the pose. Most people will find the best alignment on their forearms where their spine can stay nice and long, nice and straight, and still get a very good stretch here. Personally, I like to add some active engagement into the muscles that I'm stretching. By pressing my front shin down into the mat as if I was trying to lift up, I'm making my glutes work hard for that strength and that movement at the same time as I'm stretching. This is called isometric stretching and is a really safe and efficient way to find a deeper range of movement in your hip. So let's have a look at this shin parallel to the front line of the mat concept, as it seems to be something that causes a lot of confusion. Your front leg, the shin can be perhaps more parallel or fully parallel with the front line of your mat, but this is going to mean that the front leg hip needs to externally rotate even more. So this should be considered advancing the stretch. The glutes have to stretch further, the inner thigh has to lengthen further, so it's perhaps something you can progress towards. The further away the front foot from the body, the more intense the stretch becomes, so you can stay anywhere in between fully back and fully parallel. So just a visual for that, the foot being back towards the hip here is going to be less intense than the foot being forwards towards the wrist. Now you might notice here that this means your hips are going to be higher up because the range of flexibility is more demanding. Now that's not to say that you can't practice this variation if your hips are perhaps similar like mine and struggle to sit anywhere near the floor here, but it's a much deeper stretch, so perhaps using blocks, props, something to help prop up that gap so that you can allow the body to rest into this intense stretch, keeping this shin diagonal with the mat. Now, in this variation, the shin is now pointing forwards. It's no longer pointing down. So we're very much able to flex the foot, toes up towards shin to help protect the knee, and perhaps just be a little bit more aware of your knee when you're taking this deeper stretch variation. In terms of more advanced pigeon variations, such as mermaid or king pigeon, where we're holding our foot behind our back, because there's a balance element brought into here, we no longer have our hands to support us. The lower we are towards the mat, so the lower our centre of gravity, the more accessible balance becomes. Therefore, if you're working on these advanced variations, taking the shin more diagonal to allow your hips to sink low is going to be a more approachable version of pigeon. You might also want to consider the use of blocks or props to help your pelvis stay steady, but also work on pushing down into the shin, like I mentioned with the isometric stretching, to help give you strength and stability to hold yourself away from the mat whilst your arms do their thing. We also have to consider that because the back leg is bending in, the heel is coming in towards our bum, that makes the stretch into the front of the back leg, so the quad and the hip flexor, that more intense, which is also going to make the hips lift even higher, making our balance even harder. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope this was helpful and it helps you and your pigeons have a happy life ahead. If you'd like to take a class that works on this external hip rotation flexibility, you can find that on this side, and you can find many more tutorials of this sort of style in this playlist just here. If you found this helpful, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date with new classes and new videos which I release each week.